He woke up in a stranger's ruin, drowning in debt, buried under a dead man's mistakes, with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to fall. What he didn't expect was the man who kept appearing in every doorway of his new life, golden-eyed, unnervingly calm, watching him like something had already been decided between them long before Julian ever agreed to it. No one warned him that a crown prince could turn obsession into strategy, and patience into a trap laced with silk, secrets, and one very expensive bottle of wine. By the time Julian understood what was happening, it was already written into his blood, his title, his future. What exactly had the future emperor been planning from the very first moment their eyes met? And why didn't Julian see it coming until it was far too late? Stay till the end to find out. Pull up a chair and let us walk you through the story of Julian Ashford, the broke, disaster-prone noble who accidentally caught the attention of an emperor who simply refused to leave him alone. If you have ever wished a devastatingly handsome stranger would just show up out of nowhere and fix all your financial problems for you, tell us about it in the comments below. The first thing Julian Ashford noticed was that he was, against all reasonable expectation, no longer dead. The second thing he noticed was that someone was screaming his name, or rather, a name that was apparently his now, directly into his ear. My lord, please! Wake up! Julian groaned and cracked open his eyes. A wooden ceiling looked back at him. Dark beams crossed overhead, carved at the joints with small snarling dragons. That struck him as odd. The last thing he remembered clearly was the blue glow of his laptop screen at 4 a.m., his forehead meeting his desk after his 72nd consecutive hour without sleep, and the distant, funny thought that this was probably how CEOs died, not dramatically, just face down in a quarterly report. A hospital ceiling would have made sense after that. Popcorn texture, fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic. This ceiling had neither of those things, and it definitely had dragons. My lord, thank every ancestor, you're breathing. The voice belonged to a young man in servant's livery who looked seconds from either fainting or sobbing, possibly both at once. You've been unconscious for 3 days, we thought. His voice cracked and he didn't finish the sentence. Julian tried to sit up. His body informed him, immediately and without negotiation, that this was a terrible idea. His skull throbbed like it had personally offended a percussion section. Before he could ask the very reasonable question of where exactly am I, the answer arrived on its own, not as an explanation, but as a flood. Memories that weren't his. Julian Ashford, 24 years old, alpha, head of a noble house that had once meant something. A man who had spent the last several years doing an extraordinarily thorough job of destroying his own life, drinking through inheritances, gambling away entire harvests, chasing after pretty omegas who left the moment the money did, and treating responsibility as a word that applied to other people. The Ashford estate hadn't just fallen on hard times. It had fallen off a cliff and kept falling. Servants hadn't been paid in 4 months. Half the household staff had already quietly packed their bags. Julian's father, the original Julian's father, had died of what the physicians diplomatically called a weakened heart, and what the household privately called watching his son burn the family down for entertainment. His extended relatives no longer said his name in polite company. They called him the curse of House Ashford instead. Julian stared at the ceiling dragons for a long moment. Then he stared at them a little longer, because it felt like the kind of situation that deserved extra staring. He had gone from Fortune 500 CEO to bankrupt disgrace of a nobleman in the space of a blink, and honestly, this felt like an extremely unfair trade. My lord, the servant asked, wringing his hands. Julian rubbed his temples. What day is it? The young man blinked, clearly expecting a more dramatic first sentence. It's Tuesday, my lord. That doesn't help me even slightly. The servant looked even more lost. Julian exhaled slowly through his nose and did the only sensible thing available to him. He catalogued the disaster. New world. Ancient empire, apparently one with actual functioning bureaucracy and social castes divided into alpha, beta, and omega, the kind of setup he vaguely remembered from novels his little sister used to read. And on top of all of that, an inherited financial catastrophe, so severe it might qualify as a natural disaster. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. A sharp knock hit the door before it opened, without waiting for permission. An elderly steward entered, arms full of papers, his face carrying the specific, hollowed-out exhaustion of a man who had stopped expecting good news sometime around the previous winter. "You're awake," the steward said. in the tone of someone confirming a fact rather than celebrating one. Julian nodded carefully, testing whether his neck still worked. The steward crossed the room and set the stack of papers down on the edge of the bed with a soft, final-sounding thump. "These are the overdue accounts, my lord." Julian looked at the pile. It was not a modest pile. "That can't possibly all be bills." "It is." He opened his mouth, found nothing useful to say, and closed it again. "There is a second stack in the hall," the steward added, with the calm cruelty of a man who had simply run out of the energy required for gentleness. Julian briefly considered the appeal of dying a second time. The steward folded his arms. "With respect, my lord, the estate holds enough coin to survive perhaps 2 weeks, assuming no one eats." Julian closed his eyes. The steward, apparently deciding that mercy was no longer part of his job description, kept going. The western fields had already been sold to cover a gambling debt. The southern warehouse had been repossessed by creditors the previous spring. 3 separate merchant guilds were demanding payment with increasingly threatening language. And the household staff, what remained of it, were one missed payday away from walking out entirely. Each sentence landed like a personal insult, even though, strictly speaking, none of it was Julian's fault. The previous Julian had clearly possessed a rare and specific talent, not for business, for ruin. Slowly, Julian opened his eyes again. He expected panic. He'd earned panic, fair and square. Instead, something else settled into his chest, something familiar. Something that had once kept him awake through 100 red quarters and 1 near bankruptcy of his own company back when he was 26 and had absolutely no business running anything. Excitement. A problem with edges he could actually grip. This was just another failing company. A significantly larger one, with dragons carved into the ceiling and a currency he didn't understand yet, but fixable all the same. The steward's frown deepened. "My lord?" Julian smiled, and it was the specific smile his old board members used to describe, not entirely to his face, as the one that means someone's quarter is about to get very bad. "I need paper," Julian said. The steward blinked. "Paper and ink. And whoever in this household understands numbers best, get them in this room within the hour. My lord, are you writing a will?" Julian laughed for the first time since waking up in someone else's ruined life. "No, I'm writing a business plan." The room went very quiet. The steward looked alarmed. The young servant in the corner looked like he might actually faint this time. Julian ignored both reactions and swung his legs out of bed, wincing only slightly. If this empire wanted to see what happened when a modern executive got dropped into a bankrupt noble house, it was about to find out in extremely thorough detail, and heaven help whichever merchant, minister, or mysterious stranger decided to get between Julian Ashford and a profitable quarter. 3 months later, the Ashford estate looked less like a household in crisis, and more like a household actively winning a war. It was chaos, technically, but productive chaos, an entirely different animal from the old Julian's chaos, which had mostly involved broken furniture and unpaid gambling debts. Servants sprinted across the courtyard hauling crates of porcelain. Accountants, real accountants, hired at real wages, for the first time in years, hurried between buildings, clutching ledgers to their chests like sacred texts. Merchants queued outside the estate gates from before sunrise until well after dusk, hoping for an audience, a contract, or at minimum a good word. Julian loved every second of it. None of it had come easily. The first month had been the worst. Restructuring debts the old Julian had signed without reading, firing 2 accountants who'd been quietly skimming the estate's remaining coin, and discovering, buried in his late father's writing desk, a stack of half-burned letters that told a story nobody in the household had ever said out loud. The Ashford family's ruin hadn't started with the old Julian's drinking and gambling. Not really. It had started years earlier, with a merchant partnership gone sour, a rival noble house that had quietly bled House Ashford dry through a string of favorable loans that were never favorable at all, then vanished from the paperwork the moment the debts came due, careful enough to burn every signature off the surviving pages before anyone thought to ask questions. Julian read the letters twice, could make out nothing more identifying than the shape of a wax seal too scorched to place, and filed the whole matter away, unsolved, in the growing pile marked problems for later. He had a business to save first. Whoever had done this to his family could wait its turn in line. Even the elderly steward, the same man who had once handed him a 2-week survival estimate like a death sentence, stayed through all of it, and by the end of that first month had stopped flinching every time Julian walked briskly into a room with a new idea. It was, in its own quiet way, the first vote of confidence Julian earned in this world, and he never forgot it. Lord Ashford. A voice cracked with panic across the courtyard. Julian didn't look up from the inventory report in his hands. What exploded? Nothing exploded, my lord. Good, then it can wait. The estate manager hesitated in a way that immediately made Julian suspicious. One of the kitchens caught fire. Julian looked up slowly. That is, definitionally, a version of exploding. The manager opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, clearly searching for a rebuttal and finding none. Fair, my lord. Julian pinched the bridge of his nose, the third fire-adjacent incident that week, and reminded himself that a burning kitchen was, on the whole, a much better problem to have than an empty treasury. Business, against every reasonable expectation, was thriving. His crown achievement sat proudly in the heart of the capital, the empire's first tea house built entirely around the idea that customers, given the choice, would happily pay extra for comfort. Private booths for discreet conversations, tiered membership cards, seasonal desserts rotated to create artificial scarcity, because nothing made nobles want something more than the fear of missing it. Julian had built the whole model off a vague, half-remembered lecture from an undergraduate marketing class, and it worked with an efficiency that honestly offended him a little, given how easy it had been. People are really paying 50 silver for a membership card that does nothing but let them sit in a nicer chair? Julian asked, still slightly disbelieving even after weeks of receipts. Elias Bram, his steadily more exhausted personal assistant, looked personally offended on behalf of the tea house's business model. They fought over the last 12 cards, my lord. There was nearly a duel. Julian grinned. Beautiful, truly beautiful. Nothing in the world made him happier than watching wealthy people voluntarily overspend for the feeling of exclusivity. Today was the opening of the third location, which explained why Julian currently found himself being dragged bodily down a crowded street by a rotating cast of merchants, investors, and hopeful business partners, all shouting variations of the same question. What's next, my lord? What's next? By early afternoon, he'd finally escaped into the new tea house to inspect it in person. One last check before the doors opened to the public. The place was already packed, exactly as planned. Julian moved through the halls, mentally tallying seating capacity against projected turnover, checking the placement of the lacquered screens that gave each booth its illusion of privacy. Then he stopped walking. Someone was standing directly in the middle of a doorway, not passing through it, not waiting near it, but occupying it completely, as though the doorway existed for the sole purpose of framing him. The man was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in simple black robes that somehow managed to look more expensive than every gilded noble outfit in the building combined. A few of the staff nearby were behaving strangely around him, overly polite, slightly stiff, like they were handling something breakable. Julian did not notice or care about any of that. He noticed the blocked doorway, and Julian had strong personal feelings about inefficiency. "You're in my way," Julian said. The stranger didn't move. Julian frowned. "This is my building. You're standing in my doorway." Slowly, unhurried, the man turned. Julian blinked. The stranger was, unfairly and almost inconveniently, extraordinarily handsome, the sort of face that didn't ask for attention so much as simply collect it by default. A sharp jaw, dark hair falling just slightly loose, in a way that looked less like carelessness, and more like a man who had never once needed to try. And his eyes were gold, not warm gold, the kind of gold that looked valuable and a little bit dangerous, the way a drawn blade looks valuable. Unfortunately for him, he was still standing in the doorway. "Well?" Julian prompted. The stranger stared at him for a beat too long, then smiled slowly, like he'd just found something he hadn't expected to find. "Your doorway? I own the building." The smile widened, delighted for reasons Julian couldn't begin to guess. "Interesting." "Not particularly. Move." Somewhere nearby, a customer choked audibly on their tea. The stranger stepped aside at once, immediately, without argument, which surprised Julian more than the blocking had. "Thank you," the man said. Julian paused. "For what, exactly?" "For speaking to me, honestly." The stranger said it like it was rare, like it mattered. Odd thing to say to someone who'd just told you to get out of a doorway. Julian shrugged it off and continued past him. There were inventory numbers to review, and inventory numbers didn't care how attractive a stranger's face was. Behind him, The man watched him disappear down the corridor and did not stop smiling. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Crown Prince Damien Valcrest, heir to the Empire, found himself completely, inconveniently unable to stop thinking about someone. That someone had just told him to move. Julian forgot about the handsome man in the doorway within roughly an hour, which was unfortunate, because the handsome man had absolutely not forgotten about him. A week after the third tea house opened, Julian was buried in financial reports when Elias burst through his office door with the specific breathless energy of a man about to deliver very confusing news. "My lord?" Julian didn't look up. "What exploded?" "Nothing exploded." "Good, then it can also wait." Elias set a small velvet box on the desk instead of leaving, which was new. Julian eyed it. "What's this?" "Delivered this morning. No note." Inside sat a gold cufflink set, small emeralds catching the light, clearly worth more than the entire tea house's weekly revenue. Julian closed the box. "Return it." Elias blinked. "Return it? My lord, this is. I don't know who sent it. There's no name attached." "Return it." Elias looked personally wounded on behalf of the jewelry. 5 minutes after he left to do exactly that, another servant appeared at the door, slightly out of breath. "My lord, a carriage has arrived." "Fine, it's carrying flowers." Julian looked up. "Flowers." "Several hundred bouquets, my lord. They've filled half the courtyard." Julian set his pen down very carefully, the way a man sets something down, right before deciding whether or not to be alarmed. What kind of person sends hundreds of bouquets to someone they've spoken to exactly once? No one in the room had an answer. 3 days later, Julian attended a merchant's conference to negotiate tea leaf pricing with a supplier from the eastern provinces. Halfway through, he spotted a familiar face near the front of the hall, listening with an expression of polite, unhurried interest. The handsome stranger from the doorway. Julian frowned. Strange coincidence. The man noticed him looking, smiled, and Julian looked away fast enough to strain something. A week later, at the construction site of his fourth tea house, the same man was there, standing near the scaffolding, hands clasped behind his back, like he had every right to be inspecting Julian's property. 2 days after that, at a charity auction Julian only attended because refusing would have offended 3 separate business partners, the man was there again. By the 4th encounter, Julian noted it and moved on. By the 6th, he was suspicious. By the 9th, a horse auction he'd attended purely to scout carriage stock for his growing fleet of delivery carts. He was concerned enough to actually count. The stranger stood near the paddock fence, evaluating a chestnut mare with the focused attention of a man who had never once in his life bought a horse and had no intention of starting today. He was there, Julian eventually realized, purely because Julian was there. By the 12th, at a bakery of all places, where the man sat outside sipping tea with the casual air of someone who simply enjoyed being wherever Julian happened to be. "I'm being followed," Julian announced. Elias nearly dropped his own cup. "What?" Julian pointed discreetly across the street. "Him, the one in black. Do you see him?" Elias squinted, looked properly, and went the color of old parchment. "My lord, why do you keep saying that like it's an answer?" "My lord," Elias repeated, with the specific tone of a man watching his own career end in real time. Before Julian could demand clarification, the stranger raised a hand and waved, cheerful as anything. Julian, on reflex and pure confusion, waved back once. The man looked delighted, genuinely, embarrassingly delighted, like a puppy that had just been praised for existing. It was deeply unsettling. That evening, the same man was sitting in Julian's own drawing room, drinking his tea, as though he'd been personally invited. "How did you get in here?" Julian demanded. The stranger looked pleased, not remotely apologetic. "Your staff let me in." Julian mentally filed that under betrayals to investigate later. "What do you want?" "You," the man said simply, like it was obvious. Julian choked slightly on nothing. "What? I enjoy your company. You barely know me. I would like to fix that." They stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Julian pointed, very firmly, at the door. "No." The stranger nodded, unbothered. "Understood." Julian exhaled in relief, briefly, because the man smiled again and added, "I'll try again tomorrow," and left with the exact same energy he'd arrived with, as if the rejection had simply been noted and filed for future reference rather than accepted. Julian felt the first warning signs of a genuine headache. Somewhere across the capital, at that exact moment, an entire team of palace ministers were quietly searching every corridor of the imperial palace for their missing crown prince. completely unaware that His Highness was, at that moment, already planning tomorrow's attempt. The Imperial Council had survived wars. It had survived 3 separate famines, at least 2 assassination attempts, and 4 emperors with wildly incompatible temperaments across 2 generations. Nothing, however, had prepared it for a lovesick crown prince. Your Highness. Duke Whitlock adjusted his spectacles and tapped a document on the long council table. The western provinces are requesting additional grain shipments before the frost season. Crown Prince Damien Valcrest glanced at the report for exactly 1 second before looking away entirely. The council waited and waited. Finally, Duke Whitlock cleared his throat with the pointed patience of a man who had done this several times already that week. Your Highness? Damien rested his chin on one hand, expression thoughtful, distant, and entirely unrelated to grain. Lord Ashford prefers strawberry pastries to plum ones. I only just learned that today. Silence. A minister somewhere down the table dropped his writing brush. Another looked up at the ceiling as if hoping for divine rescue. Duke Whitlock closed his eyes slowly, the way a man closes his eyes, right before deciding whether early retirement is still an option. Your Highness, how does that relate to the grain shipments? Damien considered this seriously. It doesn't. The old Duke's eye twitched, visibly, for the first time in council record. It wasn't only the strawberry pastries. Over the following weeks, the council learned things about Julian Ashford that no formal briefing had ever prepared them for. That he preferred his tea slightly understeeped. That he disliked being interrupted mid-sentence, a fact Damien now announced before every meeting as though it were state policy. That he had, apparently, once told a visiting foreign dignitary to take a number when the man tried to cut in line at a tea-house opening, a story Damien retold with such open pride that Duke Whitlock had privately begun keeping a tally of how many times a single anecdote could be repeated before official records needed a footnote for it. One junior minister, newer to the council and not yet in the art of strategic silence, made the mistake of asking, in what he clearly believed was a reasonable tone, whether the Crown Prince might consider limiting personal anecdotes to before or after official business rather than during it. Damien considered the question with the same seriousness he gave everything else that week, then explained, patiently, that Lord Ashford's business achievements were official business, given that they now represented a measurable percentage of the Empire's tax revenue. The junior minister had no rebuttal prepared for that, mostly because it was, infuriatingly, accurate. Your Highness, Whitlock tried again, weeks later, in a tone that had graduated from exhausted to something close to pleading. The southern trade routes require your seal by tomorrow morning. Lord Ashford is opening a 5th location, Damien said, already halfway out of his chair. The seal, Your Highness. Damien signed it without breaking stride toward the door, and the council, collectively, exhausted, and no longer willing to fight a battle they had clearly already lost, decided that this was simply how governance worked now. It had been going on for a month straight. Every meeting, every agenda item, somehow found its way back to Anthony. No, Julian. No, whatever the man's ridiculous, wonderful, infuriating name was, Damien brought him up without fail, without shame, and without any apparent understanding that this was not normal council behavior. Your Highness, the annual budget requires formal approval by week's end. Lord Ashford opened his 4th tea house yesterday. Congratulations to him, Your Highness. The budget. Thank you. Yes, the budget. Damien signed the paper without reading a single line of it. The ministers had, initially, assumed this was temporary, a passing fascination, a prince entitled to one romantic distraction before returning to duty. Then Damien had begun rearranging his entire schedule, council sessions, foreign delegations, military briefings, around Julian's tea house openings. That was when the council understood they had a genuine structural crisis on their hands. Your Highness, Duke Whitlock finally said, rubbing his temples with the exhausted patience of a man who had raised 3 difficult sons and somehow found this worse. Have you simply considered proposing marriage and ending our collective suffering? Damien looked, for the first time in the conversation, genuinely offended. I am courting him properly. Poorly, Your Highness. A few ministers nodded. Several others nodded with what could only be described as enthusiasm. Damien ignored all of them and went back to staring at nothing in particular, already composing tomorrow's excuse to visit the tea house in person. Meanwhile, entirely unaware of the political catastrophe he'd single-handedly caused inside the imperial palace, Julian was dealing with a crisis of his own. An enormous crystal vase currently occupying half his office, delivered that morning with no card attached, no explanation, and absolutely no invitation. "Why?" Julian asked flatly. "Is this here?" Elias, who had stopped being surprised by anything roughly 2 weeks ago, didn't even look up from his ledger. "Because someone adores you, my lord. I don't know this man's name." "You absolutely know this man, my lord. Everyone in the capital knows this man. I know that he's persistent and mildly terrifying." Elias muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like "you are going to get us both executed one day," which Julian chose, wisely, to ignore. He also strongly doubted Elias was actually returning any of these gifts, given how fondly he dusted the crystal vase every morning. That afternoon, at the opening of yet another tea house, business hummed along exactly as planned. Customers happy, staff organized, profits climbing steadily. For one rare blissful hour, life felt almost peaceful. Then a familiar voice spoke behind him. "Julian." Julian went still. Slowly he turned. Damien stood there, smiling again, of course, naturally. Why would he be anywhere else? "What are you doing here? I wanted to see you. Why?" "Because I like you," Damien said, instantly, without a flicker of hesitation. The answer came so fast Julian nearly stumbled over his own feet. That's not a normal thing to just say. It's true. True things don't need to wait their turn. Julian opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and found, for the first time in months, that he genuinely had nothing to say back. Damien looked extraordinarily pleased about that fact, and somewhere across the capital, the Imperial Council moved one meeting closer to becoming the true, tragic victims of this entire story. Julian had a problem. A very specific, very persistent problem with dark hair, gold eyes, and no discernible concept of personal space. "Why are you here?" Julian asked, for what felt like the 100th time that week. Damien looked up from a dessert menu he had no business reading, given that he hadn't ordered anything. "I was invited. You invited yourself. Details." Julian resisted the powerful urge to throw a pastry at the future emperor of the realm. For 2 weeks straight, the crown prince had inserted himself into every corner of Julian's life, with the seamless persistence of a man used to getting what he wanted. This morning, a supplier meeting. Yesterday, a product tasting session that had absolutely nothing to do with state business. The day before that, somehow, Julian still hadn't figured out the logistics. Damien had ended up riding in his carriage across the capital, uninvited and entirely unbothered by that fact. Across the tea house, someone was watching the two of them with considerably less amusement. Cassian Thorne, widely regarded as the most elegant and accomplished Omega noble in the capital, was at that precise moment the least happy person in the room. For years, Cassian had been treated, quietly but universally, as the presumed future consort of Crown Prince Damien Valcrest. Never formally announced, but simply assumed, the way people assume the sky will be blue. Cassian himself had assumed it most of all. Then this alpha businessman had shown up out of absolutely nowhere, and now the crown prince spent his days trailing after him like an abandoned hound that had just found its person. It was frankly humiliating. Cassian crossed the room with practiced grace. Every noble nearby noticed immediately. People always notice Cassian, tall and immaculately dressed, moving like the room had been built specifically to frame him. Julian barely glanced up. "Hello." Cassian blinked. That was not how introductions to him usually went. Most people, alpha or otherwise, grew visibly nervous in his presence. Julian sounded like he was greeting a mildly interesting tax auditor. "Lord Ashford," Cassian said smoothly, recovering. "I've heard quite a lot about you, hopefully good things." A pause, just a fraction too long. "Some of them." Julian nodded, entirely unbothered. "Fair enough." Cassian genuinely did not know how to proceed. The conversation refused to follow any of the social scripts he'd spent a lifetime mastering. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending entirely on perspective, Damien chose that exact moment to appear, and walked directly past Cassian without so much as a glance, straight to Julian's side. "I brought you something," Damien said. Julian groaned audibly. "Not another gift. It isn't a gift. It's work." He set a small wooden box on the table with visible pride. Julian opened it. Tea leaf samples, carefully labeled, sourced from a region Julian hadn't even known existed. His eyes lit up despite himself. "Where did you even find these?" Damien smiled like he'd just won an award. "I have connections." Cassian stared, genuinely stunned. The crown prince of the empire had just walked past one of the most sought-after omegas in the capital to discuss tea leaves. Tea leaves. For the next 10 straight minutes, Julian and Damien debated flavor profiles, supplier pricing, and shipping routes with the enthusiasm of two men closing a merger, and neither of them so much as glanced in Cassian's direction the entire time. It was, without question, the single most insulting experience of Cassian's carefully managed life. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Cassian interrupted. "Your Highness," Damien glanced over, faintly surprised. "Oh, you're still here." The words landed like a slap. Julian nearly choked, trying not to laugh, badly failing to hide it behind his teacup. Cassian forced a smile, the strained kind, the kind that historically preceded disasters of one scale or another in his family's long, quietly ruthless political history. "I simply wished a word with you, Your Highness." "Of course," Damien said politely, already turning back toward Julian. "In a moment. So about the pricing on the Eastern imports." Cassian's eye twitched once, sharply. For the first time in his carefully cultivated, thoroughly disciplined life, a genuinely dangerous thought crossed his mind. A petty thought. A thought with teeth. Perhaps Julian Ashford needed to disappear. Not permanently, necessarily. Just enough to stop Damien from looking at him like that. Like Julian had personally rearranged the stars for his convenience. Because if Cassian had to sit through one more conversation about tea imports, someone, somewhere, was going to pay for it. He didn't yet know that the debt his own family quietly held against House Ashford, the one buried 3 ledgers deep, the one that had, in no small part, helped push the old Ashford estate toward ruin in the first place, was about to become considerably more relevant than he expected. Julian blamed the wine. Years later, he would continue blaming the wine, loudly and with great conviction, regardless of how many people quietly failed to believe him. It was the wine's fault, entirely, 100%. The evening had started innocently enough. The 5th tea house had just broken every existing sales record in a single opening week, which by Julian's own internal rules required celebration. Staff brought out drinks. Damien appeared, because Damien appeared everywhere now, to the point that Julian would genuinely not have been surprised to find him hiding inside a supply cupboard on an ordinary Tuesday. "Congratulations," Damien said, raising his glass. Julian clinked his own against it. "To making unreasonable amounts of money," Damien smiled, the real one, the one that reached his eyes instead of just performing at them. "You're the only person I've ever met who can say that with actual affection. I mean it with actual affection, I know." Hours passed easily, the way they only do when no one's watching the clock. The celebration grew louder, then quieter as the musicians packed up and the staff drifted home one by one, until only Julian and Damien remained in one of the private tea rooms, low lantern light pooling warm across the floor cushions. Julian leaned back, pleasantly warm from the wine. Not drunk, he would insist later, under any circumstance, to anyone who asked, just warm. Across from him, Damien watched with quiet, open amusement. "You're staring," Julian said. "I'm looking." Same thing, not remotely. Julian rolled his eyes, but the silence that followed wasn't the awkward kind. That surprised him. Silence usually irritated him, a gap that needed filling, a meeting that needed moving along. Somehow with Damien it never felt like that. "You know," Damien said quietly, "the first time I saw you, I thought you were fearless." Julian snorted. "I'm not fearless. You ordered a complete stranger to move out of your doorway. You were blocking it." Damien laughed, low and real, and the sound did something strange and entirely unauthorized to Julian's chest, something he decided, firmly, to ignore. The room felt smaller all at once. Or maybe Damien had simply moved closer. Julian genuinely couldn't say which. "You keep looking at me like that," Julian said. Damien's voice dropped, softened. "Like what?" Julian swallowed, dangerously. "Only because I like what I see." There should have been a clever response waiting. Julian usually had a dozen of those loaded and ready. Tonight, his brain had apparently abandoned its post entirely. Damien reached out slowly, giving him every possible chance to pull away. Julian didn't. Julian. For the first time since they'd met, Damien sounded genuinely uncertain, just barely. "Can I kiss you?" The question caught Julian entirely off guard, not because he hadn't known Damien was interested, because anyone with functioning eyesight had known that for weeks. It was the asking that undid him. No demands, no assumptions, just a question, quiet and real, waiting for an answer that could go either way. Julian stared at him, then sighed, long, dramatic, thoroughly unconvincing. "You are unbelievably persistent." Damien's smile widened. Is that a yes? Julian grabbed the front of his robe and pulled him forward instead of answering. Figure it out. Damien looked, in that moment, like a man who had just won something he'd been chasing for far longer than a few weeks. The kiss was brief at first, then another followed. Then another, slower, and somewhere between the laughter and the stolen kisses, and the several genuinely poor decisions, made under the influence of very expensive wine, something between them shifted. Quietly, permanently, the way tides turn without anyone quite catching the exact moment. Neither of them called it anything the next morning. Neither of them admitted to anything out loud. Julian woke first, watched Damien sleep for a full, undignified minute longer than he'd ever admit to, and spent that minute quietly panicking about quarterly reports as a distraction technique that did not work even slightly. When Damien finally stirred and caught him staring, he didn't look smug about it, which somehow made it worse. He just looked settled, like a man who'd been waiting a long time for exactly this and had never once doubted it would arrive. Damien left the estate at dawn, wearing Julian's spare robe and smiling like he'd personally conquered a small country, and the household staff, watching him go, took one look at each other and collectively decided the matter was settled. Julian Ashford and Crown Prince Damien Valcrest were, undeniably, now together, whether Julian was ready to say so or not. The trouble with sleeping with a crown prince, Julian decided within the first week, was not the sleeping part. It was everything that came after the sleeping part. Specifically, the man would not stop showing up. Julian walked into his own office expecting a quiet morning of paperwork. Instead, he found Damien already sitting at his desk, flipping through financial reports like he owned them, which technically, as heir to the empire, he sort of did, but that was very much not the point. You broke in again. Your staff let me in, Damien said without looking up. I am going to start firing people. They like me. They fear you. Same outcome. Julian sighed and dropped into the chair across from him. Why are you here this early? Damien finally looked up and answered without a second's hesitation. I missed you. That's not a reason. It's a reason to me. There was a pause, a comfortable one, which annoyed Julian more than he wanted to admit because he wasn't used to comfort. Comfort, historically, meant someone was about to ask him for money. Damien leaned forward instead. I reviewed your expansion proposal for the Northern Territories. Julian narrowed his eyes. And? I approved it. You don't approve things. You're not on my board. I do now. That should have set off every alarm Julian owned. It probably did, somewhere distant and currently overridden by the fact that Damien had already started quietly reorganizing his desk while they talked. Efficient, uninvited, but undeniably efficient. I had a council meeting this morning, Damien added, casually, in the exact tone of a man about to confess something. Julian groaned. Please tell me you didn't talk about me again. A pause. Then, unmistakably pleased with himself, I may have mentioned your tea house revenue figures. Julian sat up slowly. Why? Because several ministers doubted your growth projections. And they don't anymore. Julian blinked. You intimidated my critics in a formal government session. I corrected them. That's genuinely worse. Damien looked, somehow, offended by the accusation. Before either of them could continue, Elias stepped into the doorway, froze mid-step, and slowly began backing out again the way a man backs away from a bear that hasn't noticed him yet. Did he just? Elias started. Yes, Julian said flatly, without needing to hear the rest of the question. Damien rose, brushing off his sleeves. I should return for another session. You absolutely should. But first. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to Julian's forehead, easy and unhurried, like it was simply the most natural thing in the world to do before leaving for a council meeting. Julian froze every single time. No matter how many mornings this had already happened, it did something to his brain he refused on principle to analyze. I'll come by later, Damien said. You always do good. And then he was gone, as suddenly as he'd arrived. Julian stared at the closed door for a long, silent moment. Elias re-entered cautiously. My lord, what? I believe the entire imperial administration is now unofficially scheduling itself around your relationship. Julian rubbed his face. That sounds like a problem. Elias hesitated. It is also, somehow, dramatically increasing trade efficiency. Julian looked up. Excuse me? Apparently, whenever the Crown Prince personally endorsed Julian's ventures in council, every merchant and noble house in earshot scrambled to invest before their rivals could. Stock in the Ashford Tea House brand had doubled almost overnight. 2 provinces had already begun drafting formal trade standards around Ashford brand tea, unprompted, entirely on their own initiative. Julian leaned back in his chair, slightly stunned. So you're telling me my relationship is now personally boosting the Empire's economy? Elias nodded, very carefully, the way one nods at something dangerous. Julian exhaled. I hate this world. Meanwhile, deep in the Imperial Palace, ministers were already drafting new agricultural policy, nearly all of it somehow tea-related. And across the capital, a quiet, unsettling rumor had begun to circulate among the nobility. The crown prince wasn't merely infatuated anymore. He was invested. Julian knew something was wrong the moment he woke up. Not the usual kind of wrong. Not Damien has somehow appeared in my office again wrong. Not Elias has the specific look of a man losing his soul wrong. This was different. Internal. Off in a way he couldn't immediately name. He sat up slowly and regretted it instantly. The room tilted, steadied, then tilted again, as if reconsidering his feelings on the matter personally. That's new, Julian muttered. Elias poked his head through the doorway. My lord, you asked for breakfast. He stopped mid-sentence, actually looked at Julian and went pale. My lord? I'm fine, Julian said automatically. You are visibly not to line up. That's the minimum bar for being alive. That is, at best, a technicality. Julian opened his mouth to argue further, then felt his stomach turn against him with sudden, aggressive conviction, and wisely decided to close his mouth instead. Within the hour, the estate had shifted into full-scale panic. Not the usual the business is collapsing panic, but something worse. The quiet, dread-soaked the Lord might actually be dying panic. Physicians were summoned. Servants whispered in corridors. Someone, somewhere in the kitchen, was audibly crying. I said I'm fine, Julian repeated, to absolutely no one who believed him. The imperial physician, once he arrived, ignored the protest entirely and worked through his checklist with methodical calm. Pulse elevated, temperature unstable, appetite irregular, I skipped one dinner. That is also, itself, a symptom. That's called being busy. The physician continued writing without comment. Then he asked the one question that made the entire room go dead silent. When was your last rut cycle, my lord? Julian blinked. What? Elias, standing in the corner, dropped the teacup he'd been holding. It shattered against the floor. No one moved to clean it up. Hours later, Julian sat in his private chamber, staring at the physician like the man had personally insulted his ancestors. The physician did not break eye contact. Elias stood pressed against the far wall, visibly attempting to become part of the architecture. Then the physician delivered the news the exact same way you might report the weather. Congratulations, my lord. Silence. Excuse me? You are pregnant. A beat. With child, specifically. Julian blinked once, then twice. I am an alpha. Yes, my lord. That's rare, isn't it? That's supposed to be rare. Rare. Not unheard of. It is, in fact, documented, particularly among alphas who carry certain bloodline traits, and particularly following prolonged exposure to a compatible imperial scent mark. The world seemed to briefly stop making complete sense. I'm going to die, Julian said, with total sincerity. You are not, my lord. Are you certain? Entirely. A longer pause. The physician opened his mouth to continue. Don't, Julian said. Do not say the next part. The physician, being a professional with a job to do, said it anyway. And the father is Crown Prince Damien Valcrest. Julian went very, very still, the specific stillness of a man whose entire mental flailing system had simultaneously collapsed. For one long moment, the room felt too bright, too loud in its silence. Slowly, he turned his head toward Elias. Elias looked, quite genuinely, like a man weighing the logistics of fleeing the country before lunch. Finally, very carefully, Julian said, Of course it is. The physician, entirely undeterred, cleared his throat and continued in the same clinical tone. Given the timing relative to your recorded proximity during His Highness's last confirmed rut, and the consistency of the imperial scent mark on your... Julian raised a single hand. Stop talking. Yes, my lord. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and addressed the ceiling directly. I do not have the energy for this. 3 seconds later, the front doors of the estate burst open, not literally, though it certainly sounded close, because Crown Prince Damien Valcrest had arrived, visibly out of breath, which was in itself alarming. Crown princes did not run, ever. He stopped the moment he laid eyes on Julian and broke into a smile that could have powered the entire eastern quarter. I heard, Damien said. Julian stared at him. How does news travel this fast in this empire? Damien crossed the room in 3 long strides. I'm going to marry you. No, you're not. I'm going to support you then, whatever you need. I didn't ask you to. I'm going to be a father. Damien said it like the idea had just fully landed, wonder cracking straight through his usual composure. Julian pointed at the nearest chair with the last of his patience. Sit down before I completely lose my mind. Damien obeyed instantly, too instantly, like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to give him permission to simply sit down and be happy about something. Julian exhaled slowly. This is not happening. Damien took his hand, gently, and didn't let go. It is. And for the first time since arriving in this world, Julian Ashford found himself facing a problem with absolutely no business strategy prepared for it. Cassian Thorne had never, in his entire carefully constructed life, failed at anything that mattered. That, precisely, was the problem. He wasn't built to lose, and Julian Ashford, somehow, without even trying, had turned losing into a personality trait that spread to everyone unlucky enough to stand near him. Cassian stood alone in his private study, staring down at a letter he'd spent 3 days perfecting. Elegant handwriting, carefully chosen, Deanable phrasing. A scandal, a genuinely well-built one, the kind that could unravel a reputation in a single news cycle if it landed correctly. It would question Julian's legitimacy, his business practices. Most importantly, his relationship with the Crown Prince. And buried underneath all of it, in ink Cassian alone understood the weight of, sat the quiet leverage of his own family's old financial dealings with House Ashford. The debts his father had orchestrated years ago, back when the old Julian was still drowning himself in wine and bad decisions, debts that had helped tip the Ashford estate toward ruin in the first place. If that connection ever surfaced the wrong way, it wouldn't just hurt Julian. It would expose Cassian's own family. That was a risk worth taking, Cassian told himself. He smiled and sent the letter. By the next morning, rumors moved through the capital like wildfire through dry grass. The alpha businessman is manipulating the Crown Prince. The tea houses are nothing but an elaborate financial scheme. The pregnancy announcement is a fabrication, engineered to secure the throne. By midday, half the nobility was whispering behind fans and wine glasses. By afternoon, the markets had noticeably slowed. By evening, the entire empire was watching, waiting to see which way the story would break. Julian read the report in silence, set it down, picked it back up. Set it down again, more firmly this time. Elias hovered nearby, visibly nervous. My lord? Julian sighed. Who wrote this? Elias hesitated. Cassian Thorne, my lord. Julian blinked. Who? Elias stared at him like he'd just asked who the son was. The most influential Omega noble in the capital, my lord. The one who's been at nearly every event you've attended for the past 2 months. Julian leaned back, genuinely trying to place the name against a face, and mostly failing. Oh, that one. The one who kept interrupting my tea conversations. Before Julian could decide how much energy the situation deserved, the estate doors opened again. Of course they did. And Damien walked in, calm, composed, and radiating the specific, dangerous quiet of a man who had already decided exactly what he intended to do next. Julian narrowed his eyes immediately. That expression means trouble. It does, Damien agreed. Whose trouble? Damien's smile turned thin and sharp. His. That evening, the imperial court was formally summoned. Cassian stood at the center of the grand hall, poised, confident, every inch the noble the court expected him to be. This man, he declared, gesturing toward Julian with practiced disdain, has deceived the crown prince and manipulated this empire through false claims and financial schemes. Incorrect. Damien's voice cut across the hall before Cassian could continue, and silence fell instantly. Absolutely, the kind of silence that has weight. Cassian turned slowly. Damien stood at the top of the grand staircase, Julian beside him, looking, mostly, just tired of the whole affair. Damien descended the stairs unhurried and stopped directly in front of Cassian. You've misunderstood something, Damien said, voice level, calm in a way that was somehow far more unsettling than shouting would have been. Cassian lifted his chin, refusing to yield ground. And what would that be, Your Highness? Damien smiled. I want him, not the throne's convenience, not a political arrangement. Him. The hall went silent again, quieter this time, the kind of quiet that follows a door slamming somewhere far off. Cassian went very still. That's impossible. Why? Cassian faltered, searching for the word. Damien tilted his head slightly. Competent? Successful? Mine? Cassian's eye twitched, sharp and involuntary. That is not the issue, and you know it. Damien stepped aside slightly, giving Julian a clear line of sight to the room, though Julian looked entirely unenthused about being pulled into center stage. I really didn't want to be part of this particular theater, Julian muttered. That's fine, Damien said, then turned fully back toward the assembled court, his tone shifting, lighter on the surface, sharper underneath. But I'll say this once, for the benefit of everyone currently deciding whether they'd like to test me. If anyone in this hall believes they can interfere in my personal decisions again, a pause, deliberate, letting the threat breathe, I'd suggest reconsidering their loyalty to the crown. The room understood the warning perfectly, and understood, too, exactly what had just happened. Cassian's carefully engineered scandal hadn't produced outrage or doubt or political fracture. It had produced the opposite, a public, unambiguous declaration, not of scandal, but of devotion so absolute it left no room for question. And worse, far worse for Cassian's pride, Damien had delivered the entire thing without once losing his composure. As though defending Julian's reputation before the full imperial court required no more effort than correcting a minor accounting error. Cassian left the court that evening without another word, his carefully composed expression holding, until precisely the moment the doors closed behind him. For years he had planned every step of his life the way one plans a formal dance. Measured, deliberate, always 3 moves ahead. He had never once accounted for the possibility that someone might simply refuse to dance at all and win anyway. Later that night, alone on his balcony, staring out over the glittering capital, Cassian finally understood something painfully simple. He hadn't been competing with Julian Ashford this entire time. He'd been competing with a man who had already won, effortlessly, without even realizing there had been a contest at all. What Cassian never learned, because Julian chose, deliberately, not to hand him the satisfaction, was that Julian had eventually traced the old, half-burned letters back to their source. The signatures themselves were unusable, scorched past recognition, but money always leaves a second trail even when names don't, and once Julian had actual resources behind him, he'd simply had his accountants cross-reference customs records against the dates on the letters. It hadn't taken long. A string of predatory loans, a vanished paper trail, and at the bottom of it, a shipping manifest stamped with the Thorne family crest, dated years before Cassian had ever set foot in a ballroom. Julian could have used it. One quiet word to Damien, one document slipped into the right hands during the scandal, and House Thorne would have crumbled alongside Cassian's reputation. He didn't. Not out of mercy, exactly, Julian would have argued, if asked, that it simply wasn't good business to kick a competitor once the market had already handled the job for him. He kept the letters locked in his desk instead, a quiet insurance policy he hoped he'd never need to cash in, and told no one but Elias, who swore, with visible relief, never to bring it up again. And somewhere far across the city, Crown Prince Damien Valcrest was, at that exact moment, arguing with Julian about baby names as though the fate of the empire hung on the outcome. 7 months into a pregnancy that had turned Julian into, by his own weary admission, the single most irritable man in the empire, the coronation date finally arrived. The old emperor's health had been failing for a year. The timing, everyone agreed, was simply unfortunate. The capital held its breath, not out of uncertainty about the succession, but out of pure, bone-deep exhaustion. The crown prince had spent the better part of that year behaving like a man personally sponsored by chaos, and everyone in the palace privately agreed that Coronation Day would somehow, inevitably, involve Julian Ashford. They were, of course, correct. Julian stood in an imperial palace corridor, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who would rather be handling a hostile merger than standing here in ceremonial finery. I still think this whole thing is unnecessary. Damien adjusted his ceremonial robes without looking over. It's tradition. Tradition is optional, not for emperors. Julian sighed. Then I'm relocating my entire business outside the empire's borders. Damien paused mid-motion. You wouldn't. I absolutely would. A beat. Please don't. Julian rolled his eyes, though the corner of his mouth betrayed him. The coronation hall beyond the corridor was already overflowing. Nobles, foreign dignitaries, ministers in their finest robes, and Cassian Thorne standing stiffly near the back like a man attending his own quiet defeat. The atmosphere buzzed with tension, not political this time, but purely anticipatory. Everyone was waiting to see what exactly Damien Valcrest intended to do next. When Damien finally stepped onto the throne dais, the hall fell utterly silent. He accepted the crown without a flicker of hesitation, settled it, and then, instead of turning to address the assembled court in any traditional fashion, turned and looked directly at Julian. The entire court froze in place. Julian, from the crowd, mouthed silently. "What are you doing?" Damien smiled and spoke anyway, voice carrying easily across the hushed hall. "My first decree as emperor is a simple one." A pause, drawn out just long enough for every minister present to reconsider several major life choices in rapid succession. "I will marry Julian Ashford." Absolute silence. Somewhere near the back, a minister audibly dropped a scroll. Julian pinched the bridge of his nose. "You planned this." "I did," Damien said, entirely unrepentant. "Of course you did. I always plan around you. That should have sounded romantic." It also, somehow, felt deeply concerning. The council erupted into a flurry of objections, procedural arguments, murmured protests, and yet, underneath all of it, something else entirely. A handful of nobles exchanging quick, knowing glances, as if they'd been waiting for exactly this moment for months. One minister, notably, looked openly relieved, as though a long and exhausting chapter had finally, mercifully closed. All of it was ignored. Damien raised one hand, and the entire hall fell silent again, instantly. "I have no interest in debate," he said, calm and level. "I'm interested in results." He stepped down from the throne and walked straight to Julian, ignoring every rule of ceremony that presumably existed for exactly this scenario. "I'm still saying no," Julian muttered, mostly for the principle of it. "You've said that every time," Damien replied, "and I've meant it every time." "I know." A pause, and then Damien's expression softened, the performance falling away entirely. "But you stayed. Every time." Julian looked away. "That's not the same thing. It is to me." Before Julian could argue further, he went rigid, a sharp, sudden breath, one hand pressing instinctively to his lower abdomen. Not the same startled flutter he remembered from the physician's chamber 7 months earlier, the one that had upended his entire understanding of his own biology. This was different, sharper, rhythmic, in a way that made his stomach drop for an entirely new reason. "Oh." Elias, standing close by as always, noticed immediately. "My lord?" Julian exhaled slowly. "That's a lot tighter than it was an hour ago." Elias went pale. "Is it early?" "No," Julian said quickly. Then a beat later, his expression tightened again, harder this time. "Actually, maybe." Elias didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. "My lord, we need the physician now." His voice cracked on the last word. "The heir is coming sooner than we planned for." Silence, then chaos, absolute and immediate. By the time things had stabilized, Julian sat propped in a private chamber, glaring across the room at Damien, who was, quite visibly, thrilled. "You are enjoying this," Julian accused. "I am overwhelmed," Damien corrected, entirely unconvincingly. "You're smiling." "I am coping," Julian exhaled sharply. "Do not make this dramatic." Damien stepped closer, gentler now. "I would never." A pause, softer still. "You're about to give me everything I've ever wanted." Julian hesitated. "That's precisely the problem." Damien took his hand carefully. "No," he said. "That's the beginning." Hours later, the empire officially gained its future heir. The council, by most accounts, wept openly. Half the nobility fainted at the news, one after another, in a domino effect that would be gossiped about for years. Cassian Thorne reportedly considered relocating to another continent entirely, and Damien Valcrest sat at Julian's bedside, looking like a man who had just won a war he'd started the very moment he first saw a stranger blocking his path in a tea-house doorway. Julian sighed, exhausted, half smiling despite himself. "We are not doing this again." Damien kissed his knuckles gently. "We absolutely are." And for the first time since he'd transmigrated into this ridiculous, chaotic, gilded world, Julian Ashford realized something almost embarrassing. He'd set out to rebuild an empire's worth of broken finances. Instead, somewhere along the way, he'd been quietly, thoroughly conquered himself. The imperial palace had changed in the years since. There was always noise now, small, demanding, entirely unstoppable noise, echoing through corridors that used to hold nothing but the careful, measured silence of formal court business. Julian stood in what used to be a council chamber, now repurposed for reasons the household staff had simply accepted without further discussion, apparently on the theory that emperors did not, in fact, need quiet rooms anymore. They needed something else entirely. The staff had, in the years since the wedding, mostly settled on calling him my lord out of old habit, and your highness, when a foreign dignitary was in earshot, and Julian had long since stopped correcting either one. Arguing about titles, he'd decided early on, was a battle even less winnable than arguing with Damien about anything at all. "Papa!" A small voice thundered across the polished floor, echoing off marble columns that had once hosted only solemn political debate. Julian didn't even flinch. That itself counted as personal growth. A small child with dark hair and an already alarming quantity of confidence sprinted the length of the hall, trailed by 3 visibly panicked nursemaids. The future heir to the empire, and far more concerning for everyone involved, the future heir to Julian Ashford's stubbornness in full, undiluted form. The boy collided directly into Julian's legs at full speed. Julian caught him automatically, the reflex long since built into muscle memory. "You're heavier every single day, Kai." "I'm growing," Kai declared, as though this settled the matter entirely. "I noticed." The child beamed. The exact expression of someone who believed he'd just won a major diplomatic victory. "I drew you something. That sounds concerning. It's you. Even worse." A second presence appeared behind them, slow and unhurried, entirely unbothered by the ongoing chaos. Damien leaned against the doorway, watching the two of them with an expression that could only be described as softly, completely victorious. "You're back early," Julian said, without looking up. "I finished the council session. That's not possible. Your council sessions never end early. I left early." Julian finally glanced over. "You abandoned the entire Imperial Council again, didn't you?" Damien smiled, entirely unrepentant. "Yes." Kai gasped theatrically, clearly delighted by this new piece of gossip. "Papa is the Emperor. He can just leave." Julian sighed. "I would like a refund on this entire family." Kai wriggled free of his grip and sprinted off down the hall, shouting something about building a new palace out of pastries, an ambition no one in the household attempted to discourage anymore. Experience had taught them all better. Silence settled for a moment, the kind Julian used to hate, back when quiet meant something was about to go wrong. Now he tolerated it easily because Damien was here, always, close enough to reach. Damien stepped closer, careful, the way he still did sometimes when it was just the two of them, as if some old, quiet part of him was still waiting for permission, even after everything. Julian noticed that, and found it, against all reason, unbearably endearing rather than annoying, though he'd never admit that out loud. "You don't have to ask anymore," Julian muttered. Damien paused. "Ask what?" "Everything. A beat." And then Damien's smile turned faint and genuine. "I still like asking." Julian exhaled through his nose. "Idiot." Damien leaned down and pressed a light kiss to his forehead. Familiar now, safe, worn smooth by years of repetition. Julian didn't pull away. He never did anymore. Instead, he reached out and caught the edge of Damien's sleeve, a small, quiet pull. Not enough to stop him from moving, just enough to keep him there a moment longer. Damien went still for half a second, then looked at him properly. "Don't get smug," Julian warned. "I'm not, you are. I'm happy." Julian clicked his tongue. "Oh, four." From down the hall, something crashed loudly, followed immediately by delighted laughter, followed by nursemaids shrieking in the specific tone that suggested no actual danger existed, only mess. Julian closed his eyes. "Your empire is falling apart." "It's thriving," Damien corrected mildly. Julian opened one eye. "Same thing, historically." Damien took his hand, and this time Julian didn't resist at all, just held on, easy, like it had always simply been this way between them. From somewhere down the corridor, Kai's voice rang out again, imperious as any decree. "Papa, I declare this hallway a cookies-only zone." Julian groaned. Damien smiled. And for the first time in either of their long, complicated, thoroughly chaotic lives, that particular kind of noise. Small feet, crumbs on the marble, an empire quietly reorganizing itself around a family instead of a throne. Finally, completely, felt like home. Later, long after Kai had been coaxed out of the cookies-only zone and installed instead in front of a considerably calmer bowl of soup, Julian found a moment alone on the same balcony where years earlier a different man had once stood staring bitterly at the city lights. Julian had never told Damien about the letters still locked in his desk, the ones that traced the old debts back to House Thorne. He suspected, in the quiet, private way, he suspected most things about his husband, that Damien already knew anyway, and had simply decided, the same way Julian had, that some wars weren't worth finishing once you'd already won the one that mattered. Below, torchlight flickered along the palace walls, and somewhere inside, a small voice was already negotiating for a second bowl of soup, with the confident, unshakable logic of a child who had never once lost an argument with his fathers and saw no reason to start now. Julian thought, not for the first time, about the version of himself that had once collapsed face down onto an office desk in an entirely different life, certain that exhaustion was simply the price of building something worth having. He'd been right about that much, at least. He just hadn't known back then that the thing worth building wouldn't be a company at all, that it would be a ridiculous, loud, occasionally on fire household with dragons carved into the ceiling, and an emperor who still asked permission for things he'd long since earned the right to simply take. He didn't regret the trade, not the debts, not the chaos, not the ridiculous, gilded, dragon-ceilinged mess of a life he'd inherited from a stranger and quietly made his own. He would deny, forever and to anyone who asked, that he'd ever once said that out loud. Julian smiled despite himself, turned and went back inside, toward the noise, toward the soup negotiations, toward the man waiting for him in the doorway, with the exact same expression he'd worn the very first time they met, like something valuable and a little bit dangerous, and entirely, permanently his. So tell us honestly, the tea empire, or the golden-eyed trouble that came bundled with it, which one would you have kept? We love reading your takes and theories in the comments, so don't hold back. And if you're already looking forward to the next one, hitting subscribe is the best way to make sure you don't miss it.